Welcome to the Art of Feminine Negotiation. I'm your host, Cindy Watson, and today I'm really excited to introduce you to Lisa Paul, and we're going to be talking about negotiating with death. And don't turn the station yet. I know it's a subject we tend to be very death phobic, but this is a conversation you're going to want to listen to. So welcome, Lisa. It's so great to have you here.
Oh, thank you, Cindy. I'm so glad to be here with you today.
Yeah, and for those of our listeners, if you don't happen to know who Lisa Paul is, she is the co-creator of the Death Deck. You'll hear a little bit more about that, but it intrigued me. And I was actually at an event and somebody had mentioned about this and said, oh my gosh, this is such an interesting thing I heard about. So I reached out and just had to get Lisa on the show. She's also the co-creator of EOL Deck, and they're games that inspire meaningful conversations on what matters most in our lives and in our deaths, which we tend to avoid talking about. And Lisa's also an expert contributor for Help Text, which provide expert grief and mental health support via text messages. These days, we've got a lot of issues with that. So Lisa does some great work in that regard. And she's been a licensed clinical social worker for over 16 years with expertise in hospice and 6 years in emergency medicine. And she helps people with illness, with dying, and with grief. And we've all experienced a lot of that over these last few years. So Lisa, let's jump right in. Tell us, how did you come to create the Death Deck? And like, what was its inspiration? It's kind of an odd choice.
Yeah, so as you just mentioned, I've worked in most of my career, I've spent in hospice and emergency medicine. And so, as you might imagine, in emergency medicine, what we see a lot are psychiatric and medical emergencies, right? And then in hospice, I'm helping people and their families through that last phase of life. And so, in both situations, I have time and time again witnessed that people are not prepared for end of life, whether it's a medical crisis or even while on hospice. You would think that people and families who are on hospice would be talking about the fact that this person is dying, but there's a good portion of hospice patients where, even though we've said, you have a prognosis of 6 months or less, the family's aware, the patient's aware, people still are struggling to talk about the elephant in the room. Yeah. And so how the Death Deck came to be was in 2008, I met a family, Lori and her husband, Joe. Joe was on hospice for pancreatic cancer, and they had 2 young children, 3 and 5 years old. And it was really quite a chaotic time. Because Joe was so young, he came onto hospice late, which is often the case. So we only had him on service with us for about 16 days. Yeah. And in that time, I was supporting Lori and the kids, but there were also Joe's parents there and Joe's siblings there. And there was a lot of unknowns about what Joe would want those final days to look like, because he, like most people, when he got his diagnosis, being so young and with a young family, he was determined to fight. Yeah. And so there weren't really opportunities that they found to have these conversations. So some years after I had stopped providing bereavement support for Lori, she reached out and said, "Hey, I'm writing a book. Would you like to have coffee and we can catch up?" Yeah. So we actually developed a friendship from there, and we began talking about the fact that Lori's grief was impacted by these questions that still lingered. And so we began discussing, what can we do to help people be in a better situation and be more prepared? And so we decided, well, if we can create a game that's to be played before a medical crisis, before a diagnosis, and get people more comfortable with the topic and start these conversations, then they can have the practice talking about it, as well as family members might have some inkling as to what their choices would be at end of life. Yeah. So that's how we got here.
I love that story. I did not know that actually. That it was a former patient or a client or and it's funny, there's a whole host of reasons I think why we don't talk about it. I mean, we do tend to be very death phobic as a society. I think some people are in denial, some people see it as giving up if you talk about it. But boy, as an attorney for a long time too, I've seen at the other end, it can bring out the worst in people when you don't talk about this stuff and you leave all these unanswered questions on the table. So what was some of your hope about the purpose behind the death deck in terms of how it could help address some of that, sort of negotiate through that, if you will, in a healthier way?
I think we're so cautious, we're so reluctant to have hard conversations. And and yet we all know what it feels like once you finally had the conversation you've been dreading. Most of the time, it's not as bad as we think it is,
True.
And so we really wanted people to just get a taste of talking about death and recognizing, we inserted humor into the questions to try to help people lighten up about the topic, because I find humor in every day that I work in hospice. And I can't tell you how much laughter there is, because when we can be open and we can acknowledge what's actually happening, there's room for lightness, there's room for levity. And when I walk into the home of a family that has been speaking openly about the fact that this person is dying, there's a lightness in the room, and we can focus on enjoying bringing quality time to the person rather than the chaos of trying to bring an attorney in at last minute to do a living will, advanced care planning discussions, funeral arrangements. When people have these things sorted out prior to the dying process, there's a peace. And that's what we're really trying to help people is to recognize that, yes, it's a little uncomfortable to go to do your estate plan. It's a little uncomfortable to think about, your disposition. But on the other hand, when it's done, there's room to breathe, and there's a map in place. And we can divert from the map, sometimes our destination changes, but at least there's a map, know.
Yeah.
And that's what we're trying to do, is to help people get that map.
Yeah. And I love, you're so right about the humor. As you were saying that, Lisa, I was just thinking about, and I hadn't thought of this in years, but a longtime client of mine in my law practice who was dying. And oh my gosh, he was such a rock for his family because he brought humor every day in that hospital. And he had family come, and they would go and set up tables, in the little kitchen area they had there, and they'd have these big Italian feast. And he wanted his son to speak at his eulogy, to give his eulogy, and his son was really nervous and was not wanting any piece of it. And he's like, look, the vast majority of people are more afraid of public speaking than they are of dying. So take comfort that when you're up there delivering this, most of the people in the crowd are going to wish they were in the box where I was rather than up on stage where you were. So I thought that was a great way to handle it. Now, do you have, I know that working in a hospice, it's such a trying time, as you've said, for people dealing with the decline or imminent death of a loved one. What tips do you have maybe for our listeners out there for negotiating a better experience? I mean, you've talked about humor, but both in terms of mindset and or practical to-dos, what are some things you'd suggest?
Well, first of all, you don't have to choose the hospice that your physician recommends. So there is choice in hospice, and that's true in Canada and the US. People think that if their doctor refers you to a particular hospice, you have to go with that hospice, but you can actually choose. Medicare has, for the US, has a list of ratings of hospices that you can take a look at. I've encountered people looking on Yelp now to try to get more information about the hospice. And if you're not satisfied with a hospice provider, I always encourage people to first try to work with the provider, but you can switch hospices. So that's my first point, is just that there is choice involved in hospice. The other piece to keep in mind is that a hospice it is not 24 hours a day care. It's 24 hours available assistance in terms of by phone. You can reach out and if you have a question or you're concerned about your loved one, you can call. but that doesn't mean that there's going to be a nurse in the home 24 hours a day. And so people often think that hospice means that there'll just be a nurse there all the time. And really it's that the nurse will be coming by one time a week to daily, but there is a variation based on the needs of the patient. And then I would always encourage people to accept the whole hospice team. Hospice is comprised of the physician and the nurse case manager, the social worker, the chaplain, and a bath aide and volunteers. And so the psychosocial piece that myself as a social worker and the chaplain provide is an important piece of the hospice experience. And it even helps support our nurses, because when families decline having a social worker or a chaplain come to the home, they tend to rely on the nurses for everything. And that increases our nurse burnout. So I recognize that sometimes people think they don't need these services, but our role is to provide that emotional support and anticipatory grief support, because people tend to start grieving their loved one far before they die. And so those are our expertise. And then we also help with connecting people to resources in the community, to financial aid, some of these practical things that if you don't reach out or you don't accept the visits, then you won't know the wealth that the psychosocial team can bring.
And the team is there for a reason, right? I mean, there's a lot of expertise comes together in putting the team together. And for our listeners, I would say that for everything, when resources are available in negotiating any difficult situation, take advantage of the resources that are available. So I
get all the information, right? Gather the information.
Absolutely. Now, I had mentioned about mindset, and I know we've talked about, thrown around the term death phobic a couple of times here. What advice do you have about reducing the fear?
A couple ideas. One is practice. One of the ways that we might deal with fear is by avoidance, right? And so people avoid the topic of death and dying because they're afraid of it. But I would encourage people to lean in to that fear and to just take some steps to be able to dip your toes into, there's a lot of great media, TV and movies that incorporate death and grief in some beautiful ways. I think, our game is specifically to try to help reduce some of the fear and get people practicing talking about death and dying. I think the more that we avoid something, the bigger it feels. And really, if you have a close friend that you trust and that you have regular conversations with, it doesn't need to be a professional, but I think just talking about this fear that is that you experience, and because when we give it so much power when we avoid something.
Oh, I love that advice. Lean in. I'm a big fan of that. With my Art of Feminine negotiation, I'm like, lean into your feminine, right? When we talk about the messiness of negotiations, I'm like, don't back away, lean into it. That's where the gold is. So I really like that. Resonates with me, that lean into the fear. And how do we normalize some of the conversation? I mean, practice is great advice, but both for planning for death, like within a family, but also for other people dealing with others who are dealing with death. Everybody gets so awkward and they don't know what to say. So any advice you have on how to just normalize the conversation around that?
Yeah, well, I do a lot of kind of modeling for others. On our social media, we're on Instagram and other social media at the Death Deck. And so I bring in a lot of resources and topics and conversations from a social media standpoint to try to normalize this. There's some great people doing TikTok videos in the death space. There's Hospice Nurse Penny and Hospice Nurse Julie and Hadley. There's three. I mean, they're really big TikTok stars now who are creating content talking about what it looks like when someone's dying, how to provide care. And so I think in my circle of friends, when one of my friends has a family member die, then I will typically be the one of the people who's not afraid to post on,
Yeah.
A heartfelt message and say
Yeah.
their name and try to demonstrate that we don't have to just say sorry for your loss. We can make that more rich. We can say, Rob, I'm so sorry that your dad died. That picture, he has the best smile. I'm sure you must be missing him so much. Digging in a little bit further. And I think we can look for people modeling these things virtually, and then we can try and do that as well.
I like that advice a lot, because you're right. It does it becomes almost meaningless because it seems so unpersonalized, right? That sorry for your loss, sorry for your loss, sorry for your loss over and over again. So that's a really simple way to have a deeper connection around it. I like that a lot. And what do you think are some of the blocks that sort of interfere with people being able to deal with this more meaningfully and get those best negotiated outcomes around the death talk, for want of a better term?
We're afraid of saying something wrong, and so we don't say anything at all. And I think that's a common one. Yeah. I didn't know what to say. And I would say that most of the time it's better to reach out and show up for people. And if you fumble a bit, that's okay. Yeah. But, if you can speak to, my best suggestion for the grief, supporting someone in grief, is to not be afraid to say the person's name, to not be afraid to talk about the person who died, because that tends to be the biggest feedback the grievers have, is no one wants to talk about it anymore. I feel so alone. Yeah. So just being willing to listen is a wonderful thing to do to support other people in grief. I think so being afraid to say something wrong is a barrier. Being the morbid, dark person, let's talk about something more pleasant. Why do we have to talk about this? That's the other barrier. And then I think, I hear from a lot of older adults that they want to talk about their end of life, but their kids can't bear the thought of them dying. And so they don't want to talk about it.
Yeah, I could see that.
And so, it's not what these kids, unfortunately, are doing is going to make their lives a lot harder by not being willing to have these conversations, because typically the kids are the ones left to manage the estate afterwards, to deal with the 1 to 2 years that it takes to wrap up someone's life after a death. So,
and it creates such unnecessary conflict. I mean, I've seen it over and over again.
And I bet you have.
And it ends up bringing out, as I alluded earlier, brings out the worst in people, because when simple conversations would have answered so many of the questions that they end up at each other's throats about, right? And not dealing with their grief. And I really want to, for our listeners, I'm really glad, Lisa, that you came back and put a pin in that idea about saying the name. I noticed that when you were answering about how to make that deeper connection to respond, and that really resonated with me, because it's true. We are afraid to say the name, as if it's like, I mean, I don't know what, it's like a voodoo-y kind of thing, and people just get so uncomfortable. So saying the name, such a simple thing, validate the person's life, right? Acknowledge that they were alive and living and breathing and contributing. And also showing up. I mean, you really have taken me back. My dad died way too young. And my gosh, it was I couldn't believe how therapeutic it was just having people show up and celebrate his life and be able to talk about him. So that really resonates with me. What would you say is the greatest lesson that you've learned about the death experience through your years?
Well, I would say most people, when they're actually dying, don't seem to have any fear at all. That really, all of our fears when it's far away seem to be, by the time the person is dying, 99% of the time, it tends to be that the person, we don't see any signs of fear. There's a peace that comes over people as they're dying. And I think that's why I think, especially the videos, that some videos on TikTok, I think are really helpful, because I think we think that dying is this really horrific experience, but most of the time we can manage symptoms pretty well. And the dying experience, I believe that there's a lot of emotional and spiritual aspects of the dying experience that people are going through as well. And typically it's like, I always encourage people to involve children in,
Yes.
If there's kids involved, involve the children, because, and this is true of adults, our imaginations create so much scarier things than typically what's actually happening.
That's true.
And your hospice team can really help explain what these symptoms are that we're seeing. Sometimes there's breathing patterns that sound really scary, but when you recognize that it's really just the fact that they aren't swallowing because the muscles have relaxed so much and the saliva is kind of collecting, and so that's making a different sound, it can help negate some of those fears. So
really powerful observations, both of those. I think that's interesting, that the death experience, that for the person who's dying, that there's almost never fear there, which is that is a powerful observation for the people around them who are projecting all of their fears onto them. So I think that's fabulous. And
there's a lot of feelings in the room typically, but it's not the person dying that's going through them.
Well, let's talk about that for a second. What role does emotion play? Like, I often talk about emotion in negotiations and navigating these things. It's a form of negotiation. It's a form of dance, how we communicate and have those difficult conversations. So what role does emotion play? What advice do you have around that?
Well, I think it takes bravery to have these conversations. And I think it also takes, reading the person in the situation. And so I think that when I talk to people about approaching the topic of death and dying or end of life with someone that is already sick, I talk about, okay, what's the best time of day when they're feeling the strongest? Like, let's not try to enter into these kind of conversations when it's first thing in the morning and they tend to have more pain in the morning, or if it's right before bed when they're going to be ruminating and thinking right before bed, right? And so we try to first think about the time of day and try to plan conversations for when someone's feeling their strongest. And then also being able to kind of read the emotions of the room. And if it's a particularly challenging day, then perhaps that's not the day to dig into some of these topics more. But I think the emotions of the family tend to sometimes overshadow the patient themselves. And so I'll often hear, oh, don't talk about these things with my mom. I don't want her to get distressed. And really
it's them.
It's them, right? It's mom's been talking to me about these topics and brings them up, but the daughter isn't feeling capable of having the conversation at that time. And so, I mentee a lot of social work students and peers, and I talk a lot about just being brave and being willing to say to the daughter, I recognize these conversations are hard. I wonder if it's perhaps harder for you than it is your mom. Why don't you and I go have coffee over here and let's meet your needs so we can support mom better? Because hospice patients tell me regularly that they feel alone in their dying experience because no one will talk about it.
Yes. Oh, and that's a great observation.
And I mean, I get to see so much love. I walk into people's homes and they are taking care of their family member, and I know that no one wants to think, oh, mom feels lonely in this experience. The family doesn't want that to be the case. And so speaking, addressing, being brave, being willing to bring in the psychosocial team to help you have the conversations.
Great answer. And I'm glad you hit on the timing piece as well. I mean, one of the models I teach and advocate for negotiation, I call it the 5W. And it's like, who do you want to show up as, and what are your priorities and outcomes that you're seeking here in terms of relationship, but also it's that when, which we so often don't consider. When is the appropriate time to have this conversation? So I love that you mentioned that. And I could talk to you forever. Do you have some examples that before we end up having a sign off here from your death deck? I should have told you to have it handy. I don't know if you do.
I have a deck right here.
Awesome.
We have our EOL deck as well, which the EOL deck is the deck that I use with my hospice patients. And so that one, instead of death, it's EOL, end of life, and we have a koala on it instead
Oh.
of the skull of the death deck.
Yeah.
And that's that's the one when death is closer. And so it's a little more sensitive. We're not using as much humor, but we're really getting into the end of life preferences and legacy creation. So here's one question for you, Cindy.
Oh.
I'm gonna read a question and we'll get your answer.
Okay.
After you die, how long should your significant other wait before dating?
Oh my gosh. That is so good. That's
A,
yeah.
love is unpredictable. Grab it when you can.
Yeah.
B, 6 months to a year, then it's fair game. Or C, at least a few years, or you better believe you'll be haunted.
I love it. It's funny. We do joke about that in the house, and I used to always joke with my partner, with my husband, saying C, basically like, "Oh, you better, I'll come back and haunt you." But the real answer would be A. You know, none of us want somebody being left behind, feeling lonely and grieving forever. So definitely, love is unpredictable. Grab it when you can. That's a great question. I love that, and what a fun thing to talk about.
Yes, my husband and I have had very in-depth conversations about this, including you can date anyone except for this person. I don't want you to end up with this person after I'm gone, you know?
Yeah.
We each had an ex, like, nope, you can't do that.
Yeah, and not with the kids, right? Go ahead and date them, but I don't want you to make sure. Yeah, you see that often. That's a great question.
And you know, it's playful in the conversation, you know, in the question, but the practicality of it, I can't tell you how many times I've spoken with people, with grievers who have begun dating and their kids are really pissed off. Like they're very angry, right?
Yeah.
And they'll tell me, well, we talked about it. You know, Frank and I had all these conversations and he wanted me to start dating, but the conversation never went to the kids. So, or I've experienced people who say, you know, we never talked about it. And I wish we had talked about it because I would like to have had their blessing, you know, to deal with some of the guilt and typical feelings that come up. So
I love this deck on so many levels, Lisa, right? Like it normalizes the conversation. It allows you to release some of the fear around it. As a practical matter, you get answers to these questions to deal with. I think it's a brilliant project. So give us another example from one of your decks.
Okay. If you could find out the age at which you'll die, would you want to know? A, yes, it would let me maximize every minute I have. B, no way, that would send my anxiety into overdrive. Or C, only if it's happening tomorrow.
Oh gosh, that's another hard one. I would think I wouldn't want to know, but then there's that piece of no, I'm going to stick with I wouldn't want to know and it's funny, but you know what else this deck is fantastic at? Because even as you said that, just thinking about that question, I'm like, oh, but I would want to know so that I could make sure that I've said everything that I want to say, blah, blah, blah. And as I was answering that, I'm like, I can do that now anyhow. So if nothing else, it's also a reminder to be living. So this isn't just about death. It's about how to live your best life as well. I think that's beautiful. Yeah, thanks for that.
Yeah, there's so much benefit. You know, we haven't talked about mortality awareness and like this, you know, the idea that if we really are accepting, acknowledging, reflecting upon the fact that we are mortal beings and we have our time on earth is finite, right? Then are we living the lives we want to be living? Are we making the choices that reflect the life that we want to be remembered for?
Yeah.
And I think that's a very powerful aspect of coming to terms with our mortality and being more comfortable with death.
Absolutely. That's beautiful. Well, do you know what? We're going to have to get you back and just spend the entire episode next time with you flashing some of these questions at us, because these are
fun.
I wish I'd started there. That you're brilliant. And as we're running out of time here, I normally like to end by asking, what's one of the greatest mindset shifts that you've ever had in your life? And it doesn't have to be around this issue at all. Just one of those aha kind of moments that changes how you think about something or show up.
I think that I'm now almost 47. And I think that in the last couple of years, I have been able to have less need for everything to be just so, and
Yes.
being more willing to take risks. And I think that what I've learned from that experience is that I spent too much time making sure everything was just so before embarking on, something new. And so I'm trying to practice what I preach now, and really living the life that I want to be remembered for, and taking more risks, and worrying less about what people might think about that. Because I think as women, we tend to caregive and spend so much of our lives worrying about other people. And then we all kind of we get in our middle age and we're like, wait a minute, it's time to take more risks and get the most out of what is left of my life,
I love that answer on so many levels. I love that answer. I mean, I often call it the one day mindset, right? And you're right. As women, we tend to be, when this happens, I'll get to it. When the kids are in school, or when the kids are out of school, or when this happens, or when I get one more degree, and one day. But even just when you said about everything being just so, it resonates. I mean, it's, if we're having an event that we're hosting or something, like just having people over to the house, and we so often agonize over every little detail being perfect that we miss the joy of the experience. You'd be better to just order in pizza, for heaven's sake, right? And just enjoy the time with the friends and relax a bit. So I love that answer. So where can people learn more about you, Lisa?
You can learn about us at thedeathdeck.com, and we're on social media at the Death Deck as well.
That's beautiful. And we'll make sure to put that in the show notes for our listeners. And I really do invite all of you. I think this is absolutely, so every family should have one. Give it to gifts to the people that you care about in your life. When you're going, give them as hostess gifts. I would buy them in bulk. I think it's a brilliant idea, Lisa. So kudos to you and your partner for putting this out there into the world. So, and thank you for joining us. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you. I loved our conversation, Cindy. Thank you.
Yes. And for those of you out there, I have no doubt that you got lots of value from this episode, and give the gift of sharing. Again, this is an issue that we don't talk about enough. And this is such a beautiful, simple way to be able to introduce the conversation in healthy ways that'll give you more practical answers, and to be able to deal with the situation with grace and be more prepared. So make sure to pass it around to other people, and make sure to subscribe if you haven't already done that for the podcast. And before we sign off, just want to share some ways we can work together. If you happen to be looking to up-level your negotiation skills so that you can negotiate a better life, I've got everything from online to group to my signature VIP or one-on-one masterminds to help you leverage your innate power so you can get more of what you want and deserve in life. And if that sounds interesting, check it out at artoffemininenegotiation.com, and make sure to grab a copy of my book, The Art of Feminine Negotiation, if you haven't done that yet. And that is a wrap for this episode. So until next time, go forth and negotiate your best life on your terms so you can stop missing out and start getting more of what you want and deserve, from the boardroom to the bedroom. Until next time, take care.